Homeless girl married 73-year-old millionaire. 1 week later she was shocked by what she saw. The town was a study in contrasts. On one side, sprawling estates basked in golden sunlight, their manicured gardens a symbol of opulence. On the other, the paint-chipped houses huddled together like forgotten relics of a bygone era. The air carried the faint hum of wealth, yet the whispers of desperation echoed louder in the narrow, cracked streets. Amelia Greer lived on the latter side. Her home, more a fragile skeleton of wood and memories, leaned against the wind like it might crumble under the weight of a single bad day. The creak of the porch announced her arrival each evening, the sound a stark reminder of how fragile their lives had become. Inside, her mother sat in her worn armchair, knitting blankets that would sell for a pittance at the weekly market. Her younger brother, Ethan, coughed softly from the corner, his asthma worsening by the day. Every thread of Amelia's life was stretched thin, yet she held it together with the sheer force of will. Her phone buzzed on the cracked kitchen counter. Another reminder from the bank. Another unpaid bill. She gripped the edge of the counter, the cool surface grounding her as despair threatened to pull her under. She had tried everything, working double shifts, selling trinkets, even borrowing from friends. But the tide of debt was unrelenting. Each time she managed to scrape together enough to buy groceries, another wave came crashing down. Medical expenses for Ethan, repairs for the house, overdue school fees. It was a cruel cycle and she was trapped. That evening, as she sat at the dining table with her family, she vowed to find a way. "I won't let this drown us," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But the words carried a weight that felt like both a promise and a curse. The next day brought with it an invitation, as unexpected as it was strange. A letter arrived, delivered by a neatly dressed courier who avoided making eye contact. The envelope was heavy, its paper embossed with gold lettering. Amelia's fingers trembled as she opened it. "You are cordially invited to an evening at Blackwood Manor. Transportation will be provided." Blackwood Manor. Everyone in town knew of it. Perched atop the hill overlooking the town, it was a fortress of wealth and mystery. Its owner, Victor Blackwood, was a name spoken in hushed tones. Some said he had made his fortune through shrewd business dealings. Others whispered darker rumors of betrayal and deceit. Whatever the truth, no one denied his influence. "Why would he invite me?" Amelia murmured, holding the invitation like it might explode. Her mother looked up, worry etched into the lines of her face. "Be careful, Amelia. Men like him, they don't give without expecting something in return." But desperation outweighed caution. That evening, a sleek black car pulled up outside her house. The driver, silent and imposing, opened the door for her. As the car wound its way up the hill, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into something she didn't fully understand. Blackwood Manor loomed like a dark castle against the twilight sky. Its stone walls seemed to absorb the light, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Amelia stepped out of the car, her breath hitching as she took in the grandeur. The doors swung open before she could knock, revealing an opulent foyer lit by a crystal chandelier. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet, almost cloying. A butler appeared, his expression unreadable, and led her through a labyrinth of hallways until they reached a grand sitting room. Victor Blackwood stood by the fireplace, his silhouette sharp against the flickering flames. He was older than she had imagined, mid-70s perhaps, but his presence was commanding. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of wealth, but his eyes, dark and calculating, hinted at something deeper. "Miss Greer," he said, his voice smooth but cold. "I appreciate your punctuality." Amelia nodded, unsure what to say. She felt out of place, her thrift store dress a stark contrast to the elegance around her. Victor gestured for her to sit. "I won't waste your time. I've heard of your situation." Her heart clenched. "What do you mean?" "Your debts. Your family's struggles." His words were blunt, as though he were discussing a business deal. "I can solve all of it. Pay off your loans, cover your brother's medical expenses, even ensure your family never has to worry again." Amelia stared at him, her mind racing. "Why would you do that?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because I need something in return." Victor leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Marry me." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Amelia blinked, convinced she had misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Victor said, his tone devoid of emotion. "A marriage of convenience, if you will. I need a wife to fulfill certain expectations. You need money. It's a simple exchange." Amelia's mouth went dry. "But why me?" Victor's lips curled into a faint smile. Because you're desperate enough to say yes. The truth of his words stung. He had seen through her, stripped away her pride and defenses in an instant. The room felt colder, the fire's warmth unable to reach her. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice trembling. Victor's expression darkened. "No questions. No interference in my affairs. You'll live here, play the role of my wife in public, and in return your family will want for nothing." Amelia's mind raced. It was absurd, insulting, and yet Ethan's pale face flashed in her mind, his labored breathing haunting her. Her mother's tired hands, her eyes lined with worry. Could she really afford to refuse? "Why me?" she asked again, softer this time. Victor's gaze hardened. "Let's just say you remind me of someone I lost a long time ago." That night, Amelia returned home, the weight of Victor's proposition pressing down on her. Her family noticed her silence, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling and weighing the impossible choice before her. By morning, the decision was made. When the sleek black car returned to her door, she stepped inside, leaving behind the world she had known. As the car climbed the hill once more, Amelia felt a mix of fear and determination. She didn't trust Victor Blackwood, but she couldn't ignore the lifeline he had thrown her family. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it. For them. Amelia sat at the edge of her bed, the weight of Victor Blackwood's proposal pressing heavily on her shoulders. The morning sun filtered through the threadbare curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Her mother shuffled in from the kitchen, a steaming cup of tea in her hand. "You've been quiet," her mother said gently, setting the cup down on the rickety table. "What's troubling you?" Amelia hesitated. She had wanted to shield her family from the details, but there was no escaping it now. "I received an offer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor Blackwood wants to marry me. He'll take care of everything. Our debts, Ethan's treatments, the house, if I agree." Her mother's face turned pale, the tea forgotten. "Marry him? That man is twice your age." "More than twice," Amelia admitted, staring down at her hands. "But he's offering a way out, a way to save us." Silence hung between them, broken only by Ethan's soft coughs from the other room. Her mother's expression shifted from shock to sorrow. "You're too young to make this kind of sacrifice." Amelia looked up, her eyes steely. "I don't have a choice. Do you think I want this? But what happens if I say no? We lose the house. Ethan doesn't get his medicine. Her voice broke. "I can't let that happen." Her mother reached out, clasping her hand tightly. "If this is what you think you must do, then I'll stand by you. But Amelia, be careful. Men like Victor, they don't do anything out of kindness." The marriage was a cold, impersonal affair. A judge officiated in the dimly lit study of Blackwood Manor, with only a handful of witnesses present. The ceremony felt more like a business transaction than a union. Victor barely looked at Amelia as he slipped the ring onto her trembling finger. The band was heavy, studded with diamonds, yet it felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love. The staff lined up outside the grand hall to greet her as Mrs. Blackwood. Their faces were neutral, some even bordering on wary, but one woman, a middle-aged housekeeper with a weathered face, lingered, her gaze intense. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," the housekeeper said, her voice low. "If you need anything, call for me. I'm Margaret." Amelia nodded, grateful for even a semblance of warmth, but Margaret's expression carried a warning, unspoken yet palpable. Life at Blackwood Manor was both luxurious and suffocating. The house itself was a labyrinth of marble floors, grand staircases, and corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The rooms were filled with opulent furnishings, but the atmosphere was eerily still, as if time had stopped within its walls. Victor remained distant, retreating to his study for hours at a time. When they did interact, his demeanor was curt, almost clinical. He spoke of public appearances and expectations but offered no glimpse into his thoughts or feelings. To Amelia, he was an enigma, one she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. The staff, too, acted strangely, their conversations hushed whenever she entered a room. Margaret, who seemed to know the house's secrets, offered cryptic advice in private moments. "Don't wander into the East Wing," Margaret warned one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some doors are better left unopened." Amelia's curiosity burned, but the fear in Margaret's eyes was enough to keep her from asking further questions. For now, the unease deepened as Amelia began to notice peculiarities around the manor. There were locked doors scattered throughout the house, some with rusted locks, others with shiny new ones. When she asked Victor about them, he dismissed her questions with a wave of his hand. "Those rooms are of no concern to you. The halls were lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, their gazes seeming to follow her as she moved. One portrait in particular caught her attention. A striking woman with piercing green eyes and a haunting smile. She looked familiar, though Amelia couldn't place why. "Who is she?" Amelia asked Margaret one evening. Margaret hesitated. "That's Evelyn Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood's late wife." "What happened to her?" Margaret glanced over her shoulder, as if ensuring they were alone. "She died. Tragically. It's best not to ask too many questions, Mrs. Blackwood." Amelia's skin prickled. The more she learned about Evelyn, the more she felt the woman's presence lingering in the house, like a shadow that refused to fade. Victor's behavior only added to her unease. He would vanish for hours, sometimes days, leaving her alone in the cavernous estate. When he returned, his mood was darker, his tone sharper. She tried to piece together the puzzle of his life, but he guarded his secrets fiercely. One evening, while exploring the manor, Amelia stumbled upon a small study tucked away behind a concealed door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with shelves of old books and papers. On the desk lay a stack of letters, tied together with a fraying ribbon. Unable to resist, she opened the first one. The letter was addressed to Victor, written in elegant handwriting. As she read, her heart sank. The words spoke of betrayal and anger, hinting at a long-standing feud between the Blackwoods and her own family. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the letters, each one revealing more about a vendetta that had spanned decades. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she found a leather-bound journal. The entries were written in Victor's hand, the ink smudged in places as if he had written in haste or anger. As she read, the truth began to unfold. Victor's late wife, Evelyn, had died under mysterious circumstances. The journal hinted at a falling out with someone from Amelia's lineage, though the details were vague. One entry caught her eye. "They took everything from me. Evelyn's death was no accident, and I will make them pay, every last one of them." Amelia's blood ran cold. She realized the marriage wasn't about her. It was about revenge. Victor had orchestrated everything, manipulating her desperation to pull her into his world. The next morning, she confronted Victor in his study, clutching the journal in her trembling hands. "What is this?" she demanded, slamming it onto the desk. Victor looked up, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "You've been snooping. You married me to punish my family," Amelia accused, her voice shaking. "You used me." Victor stood, his towering presence intimidating. "Careful, Amelia. You're in no position to make accusations." She refused to back down. "Why? What did my family ever do to you?" Victor's jaw tightened. "They destroyed the only person I ever loved. Evelyn's death was because of them." Amelia felt a pang of guilt and anger. She didn't know the details, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't be a pawn in his twisted game. Amelia's curiosity finally overcame her fear. She stood before the locked door in the east wing, her heart pounding in her chest. Margaret's warnings echoed in her mind, but the journal's revelations had left her no choice. If Victor Blackwood's vendetta was tied to this room, she needed to know the truth. The key was hidden in Victor's study, tucked inside a hollowed-out book. She had found it after hours of searching, her hands shaking as she slipped it into her pocket. Now, she hesitated for only a moment before sliding it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room lined with portraits, photographs, and memorabilia. At first glance, it looked like a shrine. Candles flickered on a marble table, their wax pooling onto the surface. The centerpiece was a large painting of Evelyn, her green eyes piercing even in oil. But as Amelia stepped closer, the room's true nature revealed itself. The walls were lined with articles, letters, and notes, all meticulously organized. At the center of it all was a family tree, her family's name circled in red. Lines connected it to Victor's lineage, with annotations scrawled in the margins. Words like betrayal, embezzlement, and ruin leapt out at her. On a table beneath the family tree sat a photo of her father, younger but unmistakable, shaking hands with a man who resembled Victor. Amelia's chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. Her father had been involved in a business deal with Victor, a deal that had ended in disaster. The journal's vague accusations became clear. Victor blamed her family for Evelyn's death, claiming the financial ruin they had caused drove her to despair. Tucked among the papers was a letter from Evelyn, her handwriting shaky but unmistakably hers. "Victor, let it go. This hatred will consume you. Please, for us, for our future, forgive and move on. I can't live like this anymore." Amelia sank to her knees, clutching the letter. Evelyn hadn't been destroyed by Amelia's family. She had been destroyed by Victor's inability to forgive. The room wasn't a shrine. It was a monument to his obsession, his refusal to let go of the past. When Amelia confronted Victor later that night, she was no longer the timid girl who had entered Blackwood Manor weeks earlier. She stormed into his study, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. "What is this?" she demanded, throwing the letter onto his desk. "You've built your entire life around a lie." Victor didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "You've been prying where you shouldn't. You married me to punish my family," she accused, her voice shaking with anger. "You've manipulated me, lied to me, used me. And for what? To satisfy some twisted need for revenge." Victor stood, towering over her. "Do you have any idea what your father did to me? To Evelyn? He ruined us. He stole everything. And you think this justifies what you're doing?" Amelia shot back. "You think destroying my life will bring her back? Evelyn didn't die because of my father. She died because of you. Your hatred killed her." Victor's face darkened, the truth striking a nerve. "You know nothing." "I know enough," Amelia said, her voice breaking. "Evelyn begged you to let it go. She saw what this obsession was doing to you, and you ignored her. You've turned this house into a graveyard, filled it with ghosts because you couldn't let go." For a moment, Victor faltered. His shoulders sagged, and his gaze dropped to the desk. But then his resolve hardened. "It doesn't matter. Your family destroyed mine, and they'll pay for it." "No," Amelia said firmly. "This ends here. I won't be part of your game." Amelia knew she couldn't stay at Blackwood Manor. The air was suffocating, the walls closing in. She packed a small bag, determined to leave and never look back. But Victor wasn't about to let her go so easily. She slipped out of her room in the dead of night, the house eerily silent. The bag was slung over her shoulder as she crept down the grand staircase, her heart pounding with every step. Just as she reached the front door, a voice stopped her cold. "Leaving so soon?" Victor stood at the top of the staircase, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with fury. "I can't stay here," Amelia said, turning to face him. "Not after everything I've learned." Victor descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. "You think you can just walk away? After all I've done for you?" "You didn't do it for me," Amelia shot back. "You did it to hurt my family. I won't let you control me anymore." Victor's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're naive if you think you can escape. This world doesn't work that way, Amelia. You don't get to leave without consequences." The threat was clear. Panic surged through Amelia, but she refused to let him see her fear. "I'm not afraid of you." Victor's expression darkened. "You should be." Amelia bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't stop. The estate's sprawling grounds stretched before her, the forest looming in the distance. If she could just make it to the trees, she might have a chance. Behind her, she heard Victor's voice, barking orders to the staff. Footsteps thundered after her, but she didn't dare look back. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, but she pushed herself harder. The forest swallowed her whole, the darkness disorienting. Branches clawed at her arms and face as she weaved through the trees. She could hear her pursuers, their voices growing fainter as she put distance between them. But she knew it wasn't over. Victor wouldn't give up so easily. Amelia stumbled upon a clearing, her breaths ragged. In the center stood a small, decrepit cabin, its roof sagging under years of neglect. It was her only hope. She darted inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The space was empty except for a broken chair and a pile of old blankets. She crouched in the corner, trying to steady her breathing. Minutes felt like hours as she waited in silence, her ears straining for any sound. Finally, the voices faded completely, leaving her alone in the dark. As Amelia sat in the cabin, her mind raced. She had escaped Victor's grasp, but she knew this wasn't the end. She had to find a way to protect her family, to confront Victor once and for all. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The night stretched on, the forest alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant owls. Amelia leaned against the wall, exhaustion overtaking her. Despite the fear and uncertainty, a spark of hope flickered in her chest. She had faced Victor Blackwood and survived. She had refused to be his pawn, and that was a victory in itself. As dawn broke over the forest, Amelia stood, determination hardening her resolve. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The sun had just begun to rise as Amelia emerged from the forest, her legs trembling and her clothes torn. She stumbled onto the main road, where the faint sound of a car approaching gave her hope. She waved frantically, and the driver, a middle-aged man in a delivery truck, pulled over. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "I need help," Amelia said, her voice hoarse. "Please, take me to the police station." The ride into town was a blur. Amelia recounted everything. Victor's vendetta, the journal, the locked room, and the evidence she had found. By the time she arrived at the station, her fear had transformed into resolve. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting back. At the station, she handed over the journal, the letters, and the photographs she had taken with her phone. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing darker with each revelation. It wasn't long before legal action was set in motion. Warrants were issued, and Victor Blackwood's carefully constructed world began to crumble. News of the scandal spread like wildfire. The once revered name of Victor Blackwood became synonymous with corruption, manipulation, and obsession. Reporters camped outside Blackwood Manor, their cameras capturing the image of the estate's gates, which had become a symbol of secrecy and deception. Victor's past sins, long hidden behind his wealth and power, were laid bare. The journal revealed not only his vendetta against Amelia's family but also questionable business dealings and unethical practices that had harmed countless others. The public was outraged, and Victor's former allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be tainted by association. Amelia watched from a safe distance as Victor's empire unraveled. Despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the man he might have been. Beneath the layers of bitterness and hatred had been a broken heart, unable to heal. Victor was arrested on charges of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. His fall from grace was swift and unforgiving, a cautionary tale for those who let revenge consume them. With Victor out of the picture, Amelia returned to her family, who greeted her with tears of relief and pride. For the first time in months, the weight that had pressed so heavily on her chest was gone. The money Victor had used to manipulate her was confiscated, but Amelia didn't care. She had no desire to benefit from his ill-gotten wealth. Instead, she focused on rebuilding her life. She took on a modest job in town, one that allowed her to support her family while maintaining her independence. Her brother, Ethan, received the medical care he needed, and his health began to improve. Her mother, though still cautious, looked at Amelia with a newfound respect. The ordeal had changed Amelia. She was no longer the timid girl who had walked into Blackwood Manor, desperate and afraid. She had faced manipulation, uncovered buried truths, and fought back against a man who wielded power like a weapon. She had grown into someone strong, resilient, and unyielding. One day, as she walked through the market, a reporter approached her, eager to capture her story. "You exposed Victor Blackwood," the reporter said. "You brought justice to so many people. How does it feel?" Amelia thought for a moment before answering. "It's not about how it feels. It's about what I've learned. No matter how powerful someone seems, they can't control you unless you let them. And no matter how dark things get, there's always a way out, if you're willing to fight for it." Months turned into a year, and Amelia found herself reflecting on everything she had endured. She had lived in the shadow of Victor Blackwood's obsession, but she had emerged stronger for it. His wealth and power had tried to bury her, but she had refused to be silenced. Amelia used her experience to help others, speaking at local events about resilience and standing up to those who sought to control others. Her story inspired many, and she became a voice for those who felt powerless in the face of adversity. She also took time to rediscover herself. She painted the walls of their small home, adding vibrant colors that symbolized new beginnings. She planted a garden in the backyard, each bloom a reminder of the beauty that could grow even after the harshest storms. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia sat on the porch of their home, watching Ethan chase fireflies in the yard. Her mother sat beside her, knitting another blanket, this one adorned with bright, hopeful patterns. "You've come a long way, Amelia," her mother said, her voice soft. Amelia smiled. "We all have, and I'm not done yet." She gazed up at the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle against the darkening canvas. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was hers to shape now. The ghosts of Blackwood Manor no longer haunted her. They were a part of her story, but they didn't define her. As she sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of life, Amelia felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had escaped. She had survived. And most importantly, she had grown. 5 years had passed since the fall of Victor Blackwood. The events that had once consumed Amelia's life now felt like a distant memory, though their lessons remained etched in her soul. She had moved to a nearby city, far enough to escape the lingering whispers of her old life but close enough to visit her family regularly. Her days were filled with purpose, her nights with peace. A stark contrast to the chaos she had endured. Amelia had built a new life for herself. She worked as a counselor at a community center, helping others navigate hardships and break free from toxic influences. Her experience with Victor's manipulation gave her unique insight, allowing her to connect with those who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The work was fulfilling, each success a reminder of her own resilience. Her family thrived as well. Ethan, now a teenager, had grown stronger and healthier, his laughter filling the home she had worked so hard to protect. Her mother had taken up gardening, their once barren backyard now blooming with life. Together, they had reclaimed their joy, piece by piece. Victor Blackwood's downfall had become a cautionary tale, his name a symbol of what happens when obsession and vengeance consume a person. The story was often recounted in articles and documentaries, each one reinforcing the theme that no amount of wealth or power could shield someone from the consequences of their actions. Yet, for all the public attention, Amelia rarely spoke of it. She had closed that chapter of her life, or so she thought. One crisp autumn morning, Amelia stood on the balcony of her small apartment, sipping tea as she watched the city stir to life. The distant hum of traffic and the chirping of birds created a symphony of normalcy. Yet, as she stared at the horizon, a familiar unease crept over her. A package had arrived the day before, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside was a book, old and weathered, with a handwritten note tucked between its pages. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Victor's. The past has a way of lingering. Be careful where you tread. Amelia had stared at the note for hours, her mind racing with questions. Was it a warning, a threat, or perhaps a game, one final move from a man who had thrived on manipulation? She couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. For days, she noticed small things that felt out of place. A shadow in her peripheral vision, the sense of being watched, the sound of footsteps that stopped just as she turned. She told herself it was paranoia, a remnant of the trauma she had endured. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's influence wasn't entirely gone. Amelia placed the book on a shelf, tucking the note inside. She refused to let fear dictate her life again, but she remained vigilant. Whatever secrets Victor had taken with him to his downfall, she knew they might not stay buried forever. The man might be gone, but his shadow lingered, stretching far beyond the walls of Blackwood Manor. As she stood on the balcony, the wind carried the faint scent of autumn leaves, a reminder of change and renewal. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the present. Victor Blackwood had once loomed over her life like an unshakable storm, but she had weathered it. Whatever came next, she was ready. With a quiet resolve, Amelia turned and stepped inside, leaving the balcony and the lingering shadows behind. The future was hers, and she would face it with the strength she had earned.